Good day. This is Professor Emeritus Stephen Adei, your host on sustainable financial management, on how to really acquire wealth on a sustainable basis, and hopefully join my Millionaires Club. The last time we talked about why most people who never think of becoming business people could start small and become successful entrepreneurs. I hope you caught the bag, and therefore going to start your entrepreneurship journey. But I know the background from which I'm speaking from. And today, I'm going to major on the fact that you should not be discouraged by the recent challenges that the country has gone through. And therefore, let me say that even in the midst of war, sad to say, there are business opportunities. Unfortunately, those who make arms and other medical things to save the injured. I'm not asking for that type of business because we can do without them. But this is just to illustrate that you should not be discouraged. So my topic for today, the recent past of Ghana does not define entrepreneurship in this country for the future. The past of Ghana is not a good definition of entrepreneurship. This is because I'm an economist and also a family person. I run school, therefore I have nearly 2,000 parents and guardians I deal with, assuming one student has one. So if you double them on the average, parents alone will be 4,000 plus their relatives. Therefore, I know how the average Ghanaian felt when soon after COVID, there was also this debt crisis and subsequent haircut. Ghana has gone through an unprecedented economic crisis in the last few years. But one of the reasons why we felt it so sharply is that especially those who have been investing in stock market, collective investment schemes, treasury bills, suddenly had a lot of their assets locked down. They couldn't have access to that. It was also compounded by the refusal of the previous government to take drastic economic actions, especially as election loomed. I understand them, but the question is that you cannot sacrifice the welfare of the average person on the table of political expediency. But the reality was that as a nation, we were insolvent, unable to service our debts, and if it were an individual, there would have been a declaration of bankruptcy. But that is one in a lifetime phenomenon. Born in 1948, I've lived through all the stages of Ghana from pre-independence. Of course, I was too young, but at 9 years when we got the independence, I would have experienced a little bit what it was to live in the colonial days to today. What has happened is not something that occurs, and therefore it should not define your aspirations as an entrepreneur or a burden or emerging entrepreneur. Let me say that, but as a nation, we must learn about the factors that led to the crisis and subsequent domestic and external debt exchange programs so that we don't repeat it. Nothing will be as painful as Ghana within the next even half a century, if not forever, going through another debt crisis and restructuring of our debt. And therefore, we must all note that not only is it abnormal, but the causes are normal. And if we do them again, we will get the same trouble. There was expansionary fiscal stance, or the government spending more than is able to correct in a massive way year after year, borrowing either from the international capital market or through the treasury bills and bonds. And therefore, the nation overcommitted itself. Of course, that meant high debt servicing beyond the country's ability to sustain. Personally, I think that a major factor is that not only did we borrow, but we have a systemic inefficiencies whereby there's so much leakage that we are not able to get the best out of it. Of course, the most obvious is corruption. And I reckon that about 40%, if not more, of the monies we borrow goes into private accounts, wasted, misapplied, and therefore Ghana does not get the value out of it. Of course, most of the borrowing ostensibly were for infrastructural development, roads, hospitals, and the like. Those also do not immediately yield returns to service the loan. So basically, taking short-term financing for long-term projects. If you do it yourself, you try it, go and borrow for a housing, and then no having an income until the house is built and rented, and you are likely to be declared bankrupt. But on the other side, Ghana has been a low tax to GDP ratio country. In other words, we do not collect and pay sufficient taxes in order to meet what collectively we want to do. At our stage, if we're collecting about 25% of our GDP, that would have been fine, but we are hovering around 13%. And if there's also leakages, then you know, as we say, the trouble we are in become explainable. So we have expansionary fiscal policy, we have borrowing long-term for short-term and therefore servicing problem. We have corruption, we have wastages, and we have misallocation of resources. So there is a lot of inefficiencies in the system, and we don't collect enough taxes. I don't see the reason why the metropolitan assemblies of Greater Accra should depend upon the government for subvention. I don't. Even when I took over a university, or turned Gimpa into a university rather, my first task was to be financially autonomous. In other words, under me, and for decades, almost a decade and a half after me, Gimpa as a public university is not dependent on a day-to-day operational needs on government's chest, unless we find the money to do what we want to do from our own resources as a country. We will be in circles. And then, sad to say, the domestic debt exchange program and the external ones may not be the last, which we cannot afford to repeat. During the same time, I know for business people, there was the rapid depreciation of the currency, high levels of inflation, even touching 50% at one time, with treasury bills absorbing also all the money so that credit was not available to the private sector. Just unfortunate, but that was the reality. And when the government would not take adequate economic measures, countermeasures, because of looming elections, then the country had to run into unprecedented difficulties. However, I'm not saying that there wasn't any external factors, but I personally think that most of the problems that led to our economic challenges were domestic and not external. But there were external factors that compounded them. And that is very, very important for us to note. The tendency was for everything to be blamed on the external forces. But I don't agree with that. But they were significant in the sense that, for example, COVID-19 halted production for a significant part of year and a half or so. Then was followed soon about the Russian-Ukrainian war, which disrupted a lot of international trade flows and resulting global tightening of financial systems. In other words, everybody would like to hold on in times of crisis to your money than to lend it or to give aid to people. Therefore, even at the international level, interest rates were high. And the country, of course, because of its situation, could not access further borrowing from the international one. And even domestically, apart from treasury bills, the bond market virtually has been closed since. I think that as a country, there's no doubt that with a debt overhang, in other words, of about 500 million to be serviced year after year, which may rise to 1.3 billion next year, things are not going to be immediately easy. And I'm hoping that the government will sustain the fiscal and monetary reforms and bring stability to the economy. However, there is an urgent need to address the fundamental economic challenges that the country has, like low exports, and if we do mainly in unprocessed primary products, and therefore the value addition internally being low. We have still a very weak manufacturing sector, which must be strengthened and expanded. The need for Ghana to be able to feed itself, for goodness sake, that is the least. There's no reason why within 2 years, this country should not be able to feed itself. And I hope it will not be another rhetoric. Already, let me remind His Excellency Mahama that 1/8 of his term has expired. And therefore, when it comes to agriculture, we are virtually losing one season, and we haven't seen much done so far. And that is a big challenge. Again, Ghanaians must address our high appetite for imports. It's just untenable that even when you buy a brand new car manufactured in Ghana today, and somebody brings tomorrow a 15-year-old used car from America or Britain and registers it, you are likely to, the latter is likely to fetch more money because the registration is a year maybe later than that of the Ghana assembled. There is something fundamentally wrong with us, whereby we think that everything that comes from overseas is better. And now even to not manufacture toothpicks. This must stop. Nigeria stopped importing rice. They are talking about 250 million people plus. And Ghana depends on foreign rice, foreign chicken, even some fish and the rice. It is unthinkable. And these ones, you don't use normal economic measures. You use fiat. This is to stop. And of course, we cannot become autarkic, in other words, insular. We will trade, but at least you must trade with what you have earned, not borrow to feed yourself with your foreign appetite. Therefore, we must work at it, and it's the responsibility of government to make sure that strong measures, even though some of us keep on saying it and being disappointed year by year, because the Galamsey menace, the overdependence of foreign, the fact that we don't manufacture or even transform our cocoa and our minerals, is a shame. And it will not, these fundamental things must be addressed. Again, we must collect our taxes and use them well so that we get value for money. Oftentimes, the trade union people says that when I talk about low productivity of Ghanaians, they will take me on. And I'll say it and say it. Ghana is one of the lowest productivity per labor in the world. And it is an economic fact. As to why we are, it's not to blame the workers alone, because the conditions under which they work is part of it. Their attitude, a Benjuma type of attitude, the tendency of the average worker going to the factory as if he is there to steal as a right. In a can parlance, says that everybody eats where he works, from where he works. And we don't mean our salaries. We mean that what we get outside our pay by stealing, by connection, or things of that nature, that will not make the worker better this year or next year. Both the worker and the employer must change our attitude so that we go onto the productivity paradigm, so that the worker works and with the tools appropriate to their trade and to the employer. As the Bible puts it, the worker deserves his wages. I believe that, without being political, that we have an opportunity to reset our national economy in terms of dealing effectively with corruption, dealing effectively with galamsey, dealing effectively with low productivity, dealing effectively with appetite for imports, and the list. However, I say this with a tongue in the cheek, as they say it. I don't see that adequate, bold steps. We as a nation cannot live on denial and on don't. In other words, it is good for the government to be looking for people in the previous government who have done wrong and hold them accountable. But let us do it justly, legally. And also, NDC people who chopped in the past should not be allowed to go scot-free. That's my sad feeling, that the first thing is to every NDC-related person who was in court for corruption was exonerated. No, the lawyers, what do you call it, non-prosequa, that means they discontinued so that they will pursue the MPP tips. Let me tell you, both NPP and NDC historically have cheated the ordinary Ghanaian, and let us set up a system that will catch everybody. Not that when some people misbehave, they come to public to apologize, and that is the end. We as a nation must. Why am I saying these things? The reason is that many people have been discouraged as a result of this crisis. But I'm going to, in my second session, next session, going to say that the crisis has also opened up a lot of opportunities for new businesses. Whenever there is a hardship, inability to bring goods from outside and the rest, many opportunities emerge. Let me conclude, therefore, on this sad note of the pain of looking at the atmosphere in the recent past in our country, to just highlight some of the impact of the crisis on entrepreneurship. The debt crisis, or the haircut, as many meant, as we know, many bondholders, including mutual funds and individual bondholders, have had their principals locked up and the interest rate reduced. Access to capital was constrained for operations and expansion of those in businesses. When inflation was so high, the cost of capital, that's the interest rate, was phenomenal. There was exchange rate instability, making it difficult to predict and plan. Supply chain disruptions, including delays in importing goods, were experienced by many industries. Generally, in the atmosphere of uncertainty, risk goes up and planning becomes more difficult. Many SMEs, which are more vulnerable to shocks, were negatively affected, as ordinarily they have limited access to credit and weaker resilience to shocks. Again, when there's uncertainty and high risk, it's not the best atmosphere for innovations. In some, business climate became very volatile. To many, the way out was to see green pastures elsewhere, especially doctors, nurses, and teachers. But this is not the way or possible for many Ghanaians. And therefore, we must create businesses so that in this country, we can build the nation together. I know that some businesses just could not cope, especially those who depended on imports, and collapsed. But let us not end there. Oftentimes, businessmen will try 1, 2, 3, or even 5 times. You are the future of the country. Because if we don't, our unemployment situation will persist. We can't give up. And I believe that the way forward is entrepreneurship, setting out businesses that can survive. My next session, I'm going to major that despite these circumstances, there is hope for real entrepreneurs. Again, let me say that it has been good to be with you. Always, you can meet me on ZFM 101.9, ZFM 101.9, and look for Professor Emeritus Stephen Adei on YouTube and other platforms which carry my message. Shalom, and the Lord be with you, and the same time next week.